In the beginning, there was only ice and fire, darkness and light, chaos and the dream of order. The story of Westeros is not merely a tale of kings and queens, of thrones won and lost. It is the chronicle of a world shaped by ancient magic, primal forces, and the endless struggle between creation and destruction. This is the timeline that explains everything. 12,000 years before Aegon's conquest, Westeros belonged to creatures of myth and legend. The children of the forest, beings of bark and leaf, ruled a realm where magic flowed like rivers through ancient weirwood groves. These weren't the forests we know today. These were living cathedrals of power, where every tree pulsed with supernatural energy. The children stood no taller than young boys, with nut-brown skin mottled like bark and large, luminous eyes that held wisdom older than mountains. They wielded magic through carved weirwood faces, communing with nature itself. They rode elk and deer through endless woodlands, crafting weapons from dragonglass and living in perfect harmony with their world. But theirs was not a world of men. Then came the first men, bronze-wielding warriors from across the narrow sea, bringing steel and fire to a land of wood and stone. These weren't mere migrants, they were conquerors, armed with weapons the children had never seen, riding horses that thundered like storms across virgin soil. The first men saw the endless forests as obstacles to be cleared, the mystical groves as timber to be harvested. They brought the sword to a world that had known only the song of leaves. For 4,000 years, war raged between bronze and bark, between the new way and the old. The children fought with powers beyond human understanding. They could make the earth itself rise against their enemies, splitting the very land. Legend says they shattered the Arm of Dawn, that bridge of land connecting Westeros to Essos, drowning thousands of invaders beneath crashing waves. Yet for all their magic, the children were few, and the first men were many. Slowly, inevitably, the tide turned. The bronze swords pushed deeper into the sacred groves. The carved faces watched helplessly as their domain shrank with each passing year. But wisdom prevailed over warfare. On the Isle of Faces, in the great lake that would one day be called God's Eye, representatives of both races met beneath the watching weirwoods. There they forged the pact, the first treaty in Westerosi history. The terms were simple yet revolutionary. The first men would take the coasts, hills and meadows, but the deep woods would remain forever the domain of the children. The newcomers would worship at the heart trees, adopting the old gods as their own. In return, the children would share their ancient wisdom. For 4,000 years this peace held. The first men learned to carve the faces in the weirwoods, to listen for the whispers of the old gods. They built the first castles, established the first kingdoms, and slowly transformed from invaders into natives. The Age of Heroes began, but it would end in darkness. 8,000 years ago, the longest winter in recorded history descended upon Westeros. But this was no ordinary season. This was the long night, when darkness fell across the world for a generation. The sun became a memory. The moon was the only light in an endless, starless void. From the uttermost north, from the lands of always winter, came creatures that should not exist. The others, beings of ice and death, riding pale spiders large as hounds. Some called them White Walkers, the frozen dead, given terrible purpose. Their eyes burned blue as winter lakes, and their touch brought death colder than any natural freeze. These weren't mere monsters, they were the embodiment of extinction itself. Where they walked, life withered. They raised the dead as their servants, creating armies of whites that knew no fear, felt no pain, and served only the endless hunger for oblivion. The others swept south like a tide of winter, consuming everything in their path. The great castles of the north fell one by one. Kings and heroes, warriors and wise men, all became fuel for the growing army of the dead. The living fled south in desperate masses, but there seemed no escape from the endless cold. The realm of men tottered on the edge of extinction. The children of the forest faced the same fate. For the first time since the pact, the two races fought side by side, united against a common enemy that threatened all life. Then arose the last hero, a figure shrouded in legend but crucial to survival. With only his sword, his horse and his hound, he ventured into the heart of winter itself, seeking the children of the forest. One by one, his companions fell to the cold, until only he remained, a single man against the long darkness. What happened next varies with each telling, but all accounts agree, somehow the tide turned. Whether through the last hero's sacrifice, the magic of the children, or the intervention of Azor Ahai, the legendary prince who forged a burning sword called Lightbringer, the long night ended, the others retreated to the uttermost north, and men began the greatest construction project in history. Brandon the Builder, ancestor to the Starks, led the effort to raise the wall 700 feet high, 300 miles long, a barrier of ice and magic stretching from sea to sea. The wall wasn't built by men alone. Ancient spells, worked by the children of the forest, were woven into its very foundation. This wasn't merely ice, it was a prison, designed to keep the others locked away forever. The Night's Watch was founded to guard this barrier, sworn to eternal vigilance against the return of winter's dark servants. For 8,000 years the wall held. The long night became legend, then myth, then children's stories told by the fire. But the barrier remained, and the Watch kept their vigil, even as the world forgot why. 6,000 years after the pact, 2,000 years after the long night, a new wave of conquerors crossed the narrow sea. The Andals came not as desperate refugees or simple warriors, but as holy crusaders, bearing a new god and superior steel. They worshipped the seven: father, mother, warrior, maiden, smith, crone, and stranger, a pantheon that promised salvation through faith rather than mystical communion with nature. Where the first men had learned to respect the old gods, the Andals saw only primitive superstition to be swept away. Their steel was far superior to the bronze weapons of their predecessors. Forged with skills learned in the hills of Andalos, these swords could shatter bronze armor and cleave through wooden shields. But more than superior weapons, the Andals brought something more dangerous: certainty in their divine mission. The invasion began in the Vale, where Andal knights carved the seven-pointed star into their flesh and swore to drive out all trace of the old gods. They didn't seek to coexist with the existing population, they came to replace it entirely. The war was brutal and uncompromising. Unlike the eventual peace between first men and children of the forest, this was conquest without mercy. The Andals burned the sacred groves, hacked down the ancient weirwoods, and carved their seven-pointed stars into the faces of the old gods. The first men kingdoms fell one by one. The mud kings of the Riverlands, who had ruled for 1,000 years, were swept away. The storm kings found their ancient castles burned, their bloodlines ended. In the Vale, the last mountain king was thrown from his own tower by Andal invaders. But it wasn't merely military conquest, it was cultural genocide. The Andals systematically destroyed every trace of the old ways. They toppled the standing stones, filled in the sacred pools, and built septs where heart trees once stood. The faith of the Seven spread like wildfire, offering salvation to those who abandoned their ancestors' beliefs. Yet the conquest was not complete. In the north, beyond the next treacherous swamps, the ancient ways endured. The kings of winter, ancestors to the Starks, held the line against Andal expansion. Their superior knowledge of the terrain, combined with the natural barrier of the swamplands, kept the invaders at bay. Dorne, too, remained unconquered, its desert princes maintaining their independence through different means. The Iron Islands, protected by their fleet and their harsh culture, retained their own unique customs. But everywhere else, the Andals reshaped the continent in their image. The consequences rippled through history. The unified culture of the first men was shattered, replaced by a patchwork of Andal kingdoms that would spend the next 4,000 years fighting among themselves. The seeds of the War of Five Kings were planted in this ancient conquest. While Westeros struggled with invasion and transformation, across the narrow sea, the greatest civilization in human history was reaching its apex. The Valyrian freehold wasn't merely an empire, it was a realm where men had become gods, where fire itself bent to human will. The Valyrians didn't conquer through superior numbers or better tactics. They ruled through dragons, creatures of living fire and magic that reduced armies to ash and melted stone castles like candles. 40 dragon-riding families, called Dragon Lords, governed an empire that stretched from the Summer Sea to the Shivering Sea. These weren't merely rulers, they were sorcerer kings whose bloodline contained actual magic. Their silver-gold hair and purple eyes weren't just distinctive features, they were marks of supernatural heritage. Valyrian steel, forged with dragonfire and magic, could hold an edge that never dulled and was lighter than common steel yet stronger than any armor. The Valyrians reshaped the world through sheer force of will. They carved roads through mountains, built towers that scraped the sky, and created wonders that would be remembered as myths long after their civilization fell. The great pyramid cities, the glass candles that burned without flame, the sphinxes that guarded their treasures, all testaments to power beyond mortal comprehension. But their greatest achievement was control over their dragons. Through ancient sorcery and selective breeding, they created creatures of incredible intelligence and devastating power. These weren't mere beasts, they were partners in conquest, each bonded to a specific rider through blood magic that stretched back generations. For 5,000 years, Valyria ruled unchallenged. The Dragon Lords turned their gaze west, conquering most of Essos and establishing trading posts throughout the known world. They seemed destined to rule forever, their power growing with each generation. Then came the doom. 400 years before Aegon's conquest, Valyria died in a single day. The great peninsula was consumed by volcanic fire, the seas boiled, and the dragons and their masters perished in an apocalypse of flame and ash. The greatest civilization in human history simply ceased to exist, leaving only smoking ruins and twisted metal. The cause remains unknown.
Some blame the slaves who worked the mines beneath the 14 flames. Others suggest it was divine punishment for the Valyrians' hubris. Still others whisper of darker theories, that the Dragon Lord's magic finally turned against them, or that they delved too deeply into powers better left alone. Whatever the cause, the consequences echoed across the world. The century of blood followed, as dozens of petty kingdoms fought over Valyria's remains. Trade collapsed, cities burned, and knowledge accumulated over millennia was lost forever. But one family escaped the doom. 12 years before the catastrophe, Aenar Targaryen heeded his daughter's prophetic dreams and relocated his household to a small volcanic island in the narrow sea. His daughter, Daenerys the Dreamer, had foreseen Valyria's destruction in visions of fire and blood. On the island of Dragonstone, the last Dragon Lords waited and watched as their world died around them. They preserved what they could of their heritage, 3 dragons, several Valyrian steel swords, and most importantly, the knowledge of their bloodline's power. For a century, the Targaryens remained on their island fortress, slowly rebuilding their strength, while the rest of the world forgot the terror of dragons. But prophecy ran in their blood, and dreams of conquest stirred in their hearts.
300 years before the War of 5 Kings, the 7 kingdoms were exactly that. 7 separate realms locked in endless competition. The North, ruled by the Starks of Winterfell. The Vale, commanded by the Arryns from their mountain fastness. The Riverlands, controlled by the Iron Islands Harren the Black. The Westerlands, rich in gold, under Lannister rule. The Reach, fertile and populous under the Gardeners. The Stormlands, stormy and defiant under the Durandons, and Dorne, unconquered and proud under the Martells. These kingdoms had warred for millennia, their borders shifting with each generation's conflicts. No single realm possessed the strength to conquer all others, creating a balance of power that seemed destined to endure forever. Then Aegon Targaryen looked west from Dragonstone and decided the age of division was over. Aegon the Conqueror wasn't the eldest Targaryen, nor the most obviously gifted, but he possessed something his ancestors had lacked, a vision of united Westeros under Targaryen rule, and the will to make it reality. With his sister wives Visenya and Rhaenys, and their 3 dragons, Balerion the Black Dread, Vhagar and Meraxes, he commanded power not seen in Westeros since the Long Night. The dragons weren't merely large, they were weapons of mass destruction given living form. Balerion's skull would later fill a throne room, his flames hot enough to melt stone and turn sand to glass. When the 3 dragons flew together, their shadows darkened entire armies. Aegon's conquest began at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, where he built his first fort on the spot where King's Landing would rise. His initial landing was unopposed. The local lords thought him merely another ambitious exile, seeking a foothold in Westeros. They learned their error at the Field of Fire. King Mern of the Reach and King Loren of the Rock had assembled the largest army in Westerosi history, 60,000 men, their combined might enough to crush any conventional invasion. They met Aegon's force of barely 10,000 and prepared for easy victory. Then the dragons came. Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes descended from the sky like falling stars, their flames turning the greatest army ever assembled into ash and memory. 4,000 men died in minutes, including King Mern and his entire bloodline. King Loren survived only by surrendering immediately, bending the knee to save his remaining forces. The Field of Fire changed everything. This wasn't conquest through superior tactics or larger armies, this was submission through supernatural terror. The age of conventional warfare ended in Dragonflame. Not every kingdom fell to fire. Torrhen Stark, king in the north, marched south with 30,000 men but stopped when he saw what remained of the Reach Rock alliance. Rather than watch his army burn, he knelt before Aegon and was allowed to keep his lands as Lord of Winterfell. His wisdom earned him the title, the king who knelt, and saved the north from devastation. Shara Arryn, Queen Regent of the Vale, watched her son's army scatter when Vhagar landed in the Eyrie's courtyard. No mountain was too high for dragons to reach. The Stormlands fell when their king died in single combat with Aegon himself. The Riverlands welcomed the dragons as liberators from Harren the Black's tyranny. Only Dorne resisted successfully, not through strength of arms but through cunning strategy. Princess Meria Martell was too old and too wise to meet dragons in open battle. Instead, she adopted guerrilla tactics, melting away before Targaryen forces and striking when they least expected it. After years of fruitless campaign, Aegon acknowledged Dorne's independence in exchange for peace. On the day of his coronation, Aegon ordered the construction of a throne worthy of his achievement. The Iron Throne was forged from the swords of his defeated enemies, melted by dragonfire and twisted into a monument to conquest. 1,000 blades went into its making, each representing a kingdom, house, or warrior who had fallen before Targaryen might. The throne was deliberately uncomfortable, its metal edges sharp enough to cut unwary occupants. Aegon wanted future kings to remember that ruling was not meant to be easy or pleasant. It was a burden to be borne with constant vigilance. But the conqueror's greatest achievement wasn't the throne itself, it was the realm he created. For the first time in recorded history, Westeros was united under a single crown. The endless wars between kingdoms ended, replaced by the king's peace that would endure for centuries. For nearly 3 centuries, House Targaryen ruled through fire and blood, their dragons ensuring compliance and their prophecies guiding policy. Yet theirs was a reign marked by both incredible achievement and inevitable decline. The early Targaryen kings understood that conquest and rule required different skills. Aegon's sons, Aenys and Maegor, learned this lesson through blood and rebellion. Aenys was too gentle for the Iron Throne, his reign marked by constant uprising. Maegor the Cruel restored order through terror, but his brutality nearly destroyed the dynasty he sought to preserve. It was Jaehaerys the Conciliator who perfected Targaryen rule. His 55-year reign established the legal framework, infrastructure, and customs that would define the 7 kingdoms. He built roads, codified laws, and most importantly, convinced the realm that Targaryen rule benefited everyone, not just the Dragon Lords. But the dragons themselves carried the seeds of the dynasty's destruction. These magnificent creatures required specific bloodlines to bond with riders, limiting their availability. More dangerous still, they required constant warfare or conquest to justify their existence. A realm at peace had less need for weapons of mass destruction. The Dance of Dragons changed everything. A civil war between rival Targaryen claimants, it saw dragons fighting dragons for the first time since Valeria's glory days. Brother fought sister, dragon battled dragon, and the realm bled for years. When the war ended, most of the great dragons were dead, and the survivors were smaller, weaker shadows of their ancestors. The last dragon died during the reign of Aegon III, and with it, the Targaryens lost their ultimate source of power. Without dragons, the Targaryens were merely another royal house, distinguished only by their unusual appearance and occasional prophetic dreams. They maintained power through political skill, marriage alliances, and the momentum of their earlier dominance, but the magic was gone. The later Targaryen kings struggled with madness, a trait that seemed to intensify with each generation. The old Valyrian saying proved prophetic: when a Targaryen is born, the gods flip a coin. Some kings were wise and just, others brilliant but unstable, still others simply mad. Aerys II, the Mad King, represented the ultimate failure of Targaryen rule. His paranoia, cruelty and obsession with fire finally provoked the rebellion that would end his dynasty. When Robert Baratheon's hammer caved in Prince Rhaegar's chest at the Trident, 3 centuries of dragon rule died with him. Robert's rebellion seemed to end the age of magic forever. The Targaryens were scattered to the winds, their dragons long dead, their magic reduced to children's tales. The new king was a warrior who cared more for hunting and drinking than prophecy or ancient bloodlines. For 17 years, Westeros experienced a different kind of peace, one based on political alliances and military strength rather than supernatural terror. The Iron Throne remained, but it was occupied by a man who won it through strength of arms, not magical heritage. Yet the ancient forces that shaped Westeros were never truly gone, merely sleeping. In the far north, the Watch reported strange sightings beyond the Wall. Across the narrow sea, the last Targaryens grew to adulthood, carrying dragon eggs that many believed were only stone. The Game of Thrones, that deadly competition for power that consumed kings and kingdoms, was about to begin again, but this time, the stakes would be higher than anyone imagined. Ancient prophecies would prove true, dead dragons would wake, and the long night would return to test humanity once more. This is where our story truly begins, in a world shaped by 12,000 years of conquest, magic and ambition, where the mistakes of the past echo through every decision of the present. The Iron Throne sits empty, dragons soar once more through ancient skies, and winter approaches with supernatural dread. The Game of Thrones is eternal, but the players change with each age. From the Children of the Forest to the Night King, from Aegon the Conqueror to Daenerys Stormborn, each era brings new champions and new challenges. The only constant is the struggle between ice and fire, between the forces of creation and destruction that have shaped this world since time immemorial. The timeline we've traced, from primordial magic to political intrigue, from dragon conquest to democratic council, shows us that Westeros has always been in transition. Each age believes itself permanent, each ruler thinks their dynasty will endure forever, yet change is the only true constant, and so the great game continues, as it always has, as it always must. For in the world of ice and fire, there are no endings, only new beginnings, written in blood and illuminated by dragon flame, destined to echo through all the ages yet to come. Before the Iron Throne existed, before there was a unified Westeros, 7 independent kingdoms ruled the continent. The Starks held the north, the Arryns commanded the Vale, the Tullys governed the Riverlands, the Lannisters controlled the Westerlands, the Tyrells ruled the Reach, The Baratheons dominated the Stormlands, and the Martells reigned in Dorne. Each kingdom had its own king, its own laws, its own destiny. But in 2 BC, everything changed when Aegon Targaryen set foot on Westerosi soil. Aegon was not the first Targaryen to flee the doomed Valyrian freehold. His ancestor, Aenar the Exile, had brought his family and their dragons to the volcanic island of Dragonstone, 12 years before the doom consumed the greatest civilization the world had ever known. While other Dragonlord families perished in Valyria's destruction, the Targaryens survived, nursing their strength on their island stronghold just off the coast of Westeros. But Aegon was different from his predecessors. He possessed not one dragon, but 3. Valyrian the Black Dread, the largest and most fearsome dragon ever to exist, whose shadow could cover entire towns. Vagar, mighty and ancient, whose roar could be heard for miles. And Meraxes, swift and deadly, ridden by Aegon's sister wife Rhaenys. Yes, sister wife. For the Targaryens kept the blood of old Valyria pure through marriage between siblings, a practice that would define and ultimately doom their dynasty. With his sister wives Visenya and Rhaenys at his side, Aegon launched his conquest not out of mere ambition, but from a prophetic vision. He believed that a great darkness would one day come from the north, and only a united Westeros could stand against it. This prophecy, passed down through Targaryen bloodlines, would echo through centuries, a secret knowledge that would drive their actions and ultimately return with Daenerys Targaryen. The conquest began at what would become King's Landing. Here on the shores of Blackwater Bay, Aegon first set foot on the mainland. The symbolism was intentional. This would be the heart of his new kingdom. But first, he had to take it. The speed of the conquest was breathtaking. In just 2 years, Aegon conquered 6 of the 7 kingdoms. At the Field of Fire, his dragons incinerated 4,000 men in a single battle, including King Mern the Ninth Gardener and King Loren Lannister's army. The smell of burning flesh and melted armor would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. This was not warfare as Westeros knew it. This was devastation from the skies. The Battle of the Field of Fire marked the end of House Gardener, rulers of the Reach for thousands of years. In their place, Aegon elevated House Tyrell, the Gardener's former stewards, to rule Highgarden. It was a calculated move that would establish a pattern. Aegon rewarded those who bent the knee and destroyed those who didn't. King Torrhen Stark, the king in the north, witnessed the fate of those who resisted. When he saw Aegon's host approaching, with 3 dragons circling overhead, he made the hardest decision of his life. Rather than condemn his people to fire and blood, he knelt. From that day forward, he was known as the King Who Knelt, and the North became part of the 7 kingdoms. This act of submission would resonate through Stark history, creating a complex relationship with Southern rule that would persist for 3 centuries. Only Dorne resisted successfully. Princess Meria Martell, nearly 80 and half blind, sent Aegon a letter containing a single word: no. When Rhaenys and Meraxes attempted to take Dorne, they encountered guerrilla warfare, unlike anything they'd faced. In the shadow of the Dornish desert, Meraxes was struck down by a scorpion bolt, killing both dragon and rider. The death of Queen Rhaenys marked the first great loss of the Targaryen conquest, and established Dorne's independence for another century and a half. With 6 kingdoms under his rule, Aegon commissioned the creation of the Iron Throne from the swords of his defeated enemies. According to legend, it took 1,000 blades to forge, melted by Balerion's dragonfire. The throne was deliberately uncomfortable, a reminder that ruling should never be easy. Aegon wanted his descendants to remember that kingship was a burden, not a pleasure. But perhaps more importantly than the throne itself was what Aegon established, the concept of absolute monarchy in Westeros. Before his conquest, the various kingdoms had operated under different systems. Some had strong monarchies, others were more feudal, and some, like the Iron Islands, elected their leaders. Aegon imposed a unified system where all power flowed from the Iron Throne. This centralization would become both the Targaryens' greatest strength and their fatal weakness. The early Targaryen kings consolidated Aegon's legacy, but each generation faced the fundamental challenge of Targaryen rule. Dragons were both their greatest asset and their greatest vulnerability. The creatures were living weapons of mass destruction, but they were also finite, irreplaceable, and increasingly difficult to control. King Maegor the Cruel, Aegon's younger son, exemplified the darker aspects of Targaryen rule. His reign was marked by brutality that shocked even medieval Westeros. When the faith militant rose against Targaryen polygamy and incest, Maegor responded with dragonfire. He burned the Sept of Remembrance with everyone inside, including hundreds of faithful. His nephew Aegon challenged his claim, leading to the first real Targaryen civil conflict.
When Maegor had Aegon's dragon killed and displayed its head at the Red Keep, it marked a turning point. Targaryens were now killing Targaryens, and dragons were dying. Maegor's death, found dead on the Iron Throne, with multiple wounds, yet no witnesses, became the first great mystery of Targaryen rule. Some said the throne itself had killed him, rejecting an unworthy king. Others whispered of assassination. The truth died with Maegor, but his legacy lived on. He had shown that Targaryen power could be turned against itself, and that dragons could die. King Jaehaerys I, known as the Conciliator and the Wise, restored Targaryen prestige through diplomacy rather than fear. His 55-year reign was the longest in Westerosi history, marked by prosperity and legal reform. He established the King's Law that superseded local customs, created the King's Road that connected the realms, and most importantly, convinced the faith to accept Targaryen marriage customs as necessary exceptions to divine law. But even Jaehaerys couldn't escape the Targaryen curse. His designated heir, Prince Aemon, was killed by a Marish crossbow bolt in the Stepstones. His second son, Prince Balon, died of a burst belly. The succession crisis that followed would plant the seeds for the greatest civil war in Westerosi history. At the Great Council of 101 AC, the Lords of Westeros chose between Princess Rhaenys, Aemon's daughter, and Prince Viserys, Balon's son. The decision to choose Viserys established male primogeniture as Targaryen law, but it also created a precedent that would haunt the dynasty. When faced with a choice between a king's designated heir and traditional inheritance law, the Lords would follow tradition. This precedent would prove catastrophic 60 years later. No event in Targaryen history was more devastating than the Dance of the Dragons, a civil war that nearly destroyed the dynasty and led directly to the extinction of the dragons themselves. It began with King Viserys I's decision to name his daughter Rhaenyra as his heir, breaking the precedent established at the Great Council. Viserys' choice seemed reasonable. Rhaenyra was intelligent, strong-willed, and had dragons. But when Viserys remarried Alicent Hightower and had sons, the succession became disputed. The hand of the king, Otto Hightower, Alicent's father, began positioning his grandson Aegon II as the rightful heir. What started as court politics became something far more dangerous when it split the Targaryen family itself. The war began in 1209 AC, when Viserys died, and the Green supporters of Aegon II crowned him king in secret before Rhaenyra could claim the throne. When Rhaenyra learned of her father's death and her half-brother's coronation, she was crowned queen on Dragonstone. For the first time since Maegor's rebellion, there were two Targaryen claimants, each with dragons, each certain of their rightful claim. The early advantage seemed to lie with Rhaenyra. The Blacks, as her supporters were known, had more dragons, but the Greens controlled King's Landing and the royal treasury. More importantly, they understood that wars are won by alliances, not just dragons. The Hightowers brought the reach, while the Lannisters and Baratheons declared for Aegon II. The realm fractured along lines of loyalty, ambition, and ancient grievances. The Dance of the Dragons introduced a horror unknown to Westeros, dragon fighting dragon. At Rook's Rest, Princess Rhaenys and her dragon Meleys battled King Aegon II on Sunfire and Prince Aemond on Vhagar. When the smoke cleared, Meleys was dead, Rhaenys was crushed beneath her dragon, and Aegon II was grievously wounded. The sight of dragons falling from the sky like burning meteors traumatized witnesses. These weren't just weapons of war, they were the living symbols of Targaryen power, and they were killing each other. The war's cruelty escalated beyond all precedent. Prince Daemon Targaryen, Rhaenyra's uncle-husband, orchestrated blood and cheese, the brutal murder of one of Aegon II's young sons, in revenge for the death of Rhaenyra's son Lucerys. The child killers forced Queen Helaena to choose which of her sons would die, then killed the other instead. When Helaena threw herself from the window in grief, the realm saw that the Targaryens' fire and blood had consumed even their own children. Prince Aemond One-Eye epitomized the war's descent into madness. His burning of the Riverlands was so complete that it became known as the Dying of the Dragons. Entire towns were reduced to ash, and the smell of smoke hung over the countryside for months. When common folk saw dragons overhead, they no longer felt awe, they felt terror. The mystique that had protected Targaryen rule for a century evaporated in dragonfire. The war's most tragic moment came at the battle above the God's Eye, where Prince Daemon on Caraxes fought Prince Aemond on Vhagar. Both dragons and both riders died, their bodies lost in the depths of the largest lake in Westeros. Daemon's last words before leaping from his saddle to drive Dark Sister through Aemon's eye were fire and blood, the Targaryen words that had become both motto and curse.
By the war's end in 1301 AC, nearly all the dragons were dead. Of the 20 dragons that existed at the war's beginning, only 4 survived, and 2 of those were hatchlings. Rhaenyra herself was killed when Aegon II fed her to his dragon Sunfire, ending her life with the words, "Sunfire, supper." Even Aegon II's victory was hollow. He was poisoned by his own supporters months later, leaving only Rhaenyra's surviving son, Aegon III, to inherit a realm devastated by civil war. The Dance of the Dragons accomplished what no foreign enemy ever could. It broke Targaryen power from within. The dragons were extinct, the royal treasury was empty, and the realm had seen that Targaryens could bleed and die like anyone else. More crucially, It established that the greatest threat to Targaryen rule was other Targaryens. This lesson would echo through the generations, creating a paranoia and mistrust that would ultimately consume the dynasty. King Aegon III, scarred by witnessing his mother's death, ruled during the Regency and became known as Aegon the Dragonbane. Though he had killed no dragons himself, they all died during his reign. His attempts to hatch new dragons failed repeatedly, and the last dragon, a sickly creature no larger than a cat, died during his reign in 1503 AC. The Age of Dragons was over, and with it, the unshakable foundation of Targaryen rule. Without dragons, the Targaryens faced a fundamental challenge. How do you maintain absolute power when you're no longer absolutely powerful? The answer, for many Targaryen kings, was madness, paranoia, and increasingly erratic behavior that alienated their subjects and destabilized the realm. The Targaryen madness had always been present. Even Aegon the Conqueror's descendants showed signs of instability. But without dragons to enforce their will, that madness became dangerous weakness rather than eccentric strength. King Baelor the Blessed starved himself to death in religious fervor. King Aegon IV, the Unworthy, legitimized all his bastards on his deathbed, creating the Blackfire pretenders who would plague the realm for generations. The First Blackfire Rebellion in 1906 AC demonstrated how far Targaryen prestige had fallen. Daemon Blackfire, one of Aegon IV's bastards, was able to rally nearly half the realm to his cause simply by claiming the throne. The rebellion failed, but it established a precedent. Without dragons, Targaryen rule could be challenged by anyone with an army and a claim. 4 more Blackfire rebellions would follow over the next century, each one weakening the Iron Throne's authority. The Targaryens survived these challenges, but at great cost. They became increasingly paranoid, suspicious of their own lords, their own family, even their own servants. The Red Keep, once a symbol of Targaryen glory, became a fortress of fear. King Aerys II, who would become known as the Mad King, represented the final culmination of centuries of Targaryen decline. His reign began promisingly. He was young, handsome, and energetic. His friendship with Tywin Lannister promised competent rule, but the madness that ran in Targaryen blood could not be contained forever. The transformation began after the defiance of Duskendale in 2077 AC, when Lord Darklyn took Aerys prisoner, demanding concessions from the crown. The king was held captive for 6 months. Sir Barristan Selmy eventually rescued him, but Aerys emerged from captivity changed. The confident young king became suspicious, paranoid, and increasingly obsessed with fire. Aerys's madness manifested in brutal ways. He burned lords alive for imagined slights, kept his fingernails long because he believed cutting them was unlucky, and became convinced that everyone was plotting against him. His relationship with Queen Rhaella became abusive, and their children, including Viserys and Daenerys, grew up in an atmosphere of terror and unpredictability. The breaking point came during Robert's Rebellion, when Ahellas burned Lord Rickard Stark alive while forcing his son Brandon to strangle himself trying to save his father. He crossed a line that even medieval Westeros found unacceptable. The Mad King's actions weren't just cruel. They violated the most basic principles of feudal justice and honor that held the Seven Kingdoms together. The rebellion that ended Targaryen rule began not with grand political ambitions, but with love, lies, and a single act that shattered 3 great houses forever. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen's abduction of Lyanna Stark, or their elopement, depending on who tells the story, set in motion events that would topple a dynasty and reshape Westeros. Robert Baratheon was betrothed to Lyanna Stark, but by all accounts she was less than enthusiastic about the match. When Rhaegar crowned her the Queen of Love and Beauty at the tourney at Harrenhal instead of his own wife Alia Martell, tongues wagged throughout the realm. But when Lyanna disappeared with Rhaegar, Robert's rage became the spark that ignited revolution. The rebellion might have remained a personal vendetta, if not for the Mad King's response to Brandon Stark's demands for his sister's return. By burning Brandon's father Rickard alive and forcing Brandon to strangle himself, Aerys transformed a family dispute into a political crisis. When he then demanded that Jon Arryn surrender his wards, Robert Baratheon and Ned Stark, for execution, the Mad King effectively declared war on 3 of the great houses. Jon Arryn's refusal to hand over his wards was the moment the Targaryen dynasty truly fell. Not when Robert's warhammer caved in Rhaegar's chest at the Trident, not when Jaime Lannister drove his sword through Aerys's back, but when a Lord Paramount chose honor and love over fear of the Iron Throne. The dragons were long dead, but this was when the fear of dragons finally died as well. The Battle of the Trident became the stuff of legend, but its true significance lay in what it represented, the old order dying beneath Robert's hammer. When Rhaegar fell, the rubies from his armor scattered into the river, symbolizing the end of Targaryen dreams. The prince who might have been a great king, who was said to have the common touch his father lacked, died believing he was fulfilling an ancient prophecy about the prince that was promised. But the war's real horror came afterward, during the sack of King's Landing. Tywin Lannister, arriving with his army after the battle was decided, proved that he understood power better than honor. By presenting Robert with the corpses of Prince Aegon and Princess Rhaenys, Rhaegar's children with Elia Martell, wrapped in crimson Lannister banners, Tywin demonstrated his complete break with the Targaryens while ensuring no rival claimants survived. The brutality of their deaths: Aegon's head smashed against a wall, Rhaenys stabbed dozens of times, Elia raped and murdered, shocked even hardened warriors, but it also sent a clear message: the age of half measures was over. When dynasties fell, they fell completely. No Targaryen children would grow up plotting revenge, or so it seemed. Unknown to the rebels, 2 Targaryen children remained alive. Viserys and Daenerys, spirited away to Dragonstone and then across the Narrow Sea, would carry the dragon's fire into exile. Their survival ensured that the Targaryen story was far from over. It was simply moving into a new chapter. The Mad King's final words, spoken as Jaime Lannister drove his sword between his shoulder blades, were reportedly "burn them all," referring to the wildfire caches hidden throughout King's Landing. Even in death, Aerys embodied the madness that had consumed his family. The man who should have been protector of the realm was willing to destroy it rather than lose it. Jaime's decision to kill his king, breaking the most sacred oath a knight could take, saved hundreds of thousands of lives, but it also earned him the nickname Kingslayer, a title that would define him for decades. The irony was not lost on observers. The Mad King was killed not by his enemies, but by one of his own Kingsguard, a member of the very institution created to protect Targaryen rulers. The Targaryen dynasty ruled for 283 years, from Aegon's Landing to the death of Aerys II. In that time, they gave Westeros some of its greatest kings and some of its worst tyrants, often within the same bloodline. They united 7 kingdoms under one crown, built the greatest castle in the world, and created legal and administrative systems that outlasted their rule. But their true legacy was more complex than conquest and construction. The Targaryens established the dangerous precedent that exceptional power required exceptional people to wield it. Their dragons made them seem more than human, but their madness proved they were all too human. The same fire that forged the Iron Throne eventually consumed the dynasty that created it. The prophecies that drove Aegon's conquest would prove true. The Great Darkness did come from the north, and only a united Westeros could stand against it. But that unity would come not from Targaryen dragons, but from the lessons learned in their absence. The scattered survivors, Jon Snow, Daenerys Targaryen, and the kings and queens who came after, would face the long night, not as conquerors but as protectors. In the end, the Targaryens were both the best and worst thing to happen to Westeros. They ended the constant warfare between kingdoms, but they also showed what happened when power was concentrated in unworthy hands. They gave the realm dragons, but they also gave it dragon's fire turned against the innocent. They were, as their words proclaimed, fire and blood, and like fire, they could create and destroy in equal measure. The Iron Throne they created would outlast them by decades, but it would never again be occupied by a Targaryen king. The age of dragons was over, but the age of heroes, flawed, mortal heroes, was just beginning, and perhaps that was the greatest gift the Dragon Kings gave to Westeros, the knowledge that no one, no matter how powerful, was irreplaceable. Fire and blood had ruled for 3 centuries. Now it was time for something else. The death of King Robert Baratheon marked the end of an era, and the beginning of the bloodiest conflict Westeros had seen in generations. What started as a hunting accident, or perhaps something more sinister, would cascade into a war that would tear the 7 kingdoms apart, leaving thousands dead, and the realm forever changed. Robert's final moments were spent in agony, gored by a boar while hunting in the Kingswood. But the circumstances surrounding his death were far from accidental. Cersei Lannister, desperate to protect her children's illegitimate claim to the throne and her own position, had conspired with her cousin Lancel to ensure the king's wine was stronger than usual during the hunt. The result was a drunk, careless Robert, who met his end at the tusks of a wild beast. As Robert lay dying, the political machinations that would define the next several years were already in motion. Ned Stark, the honorable hand of the king, possessed a document signed by Robert himself, naming Ned as Lord Protector until the king's rightful heir came of age. But Ned's fatal flaw, his unwavering sense of honor, would prove to be his downfall. Rather than seizing power for himself or making strategic alliances, he attempted to do what he believed was right. The moment Robert drew his last breath, the Game of Thrones began in earnest. Cersei wasted no time in tearing up Robert's will and placing her son Joffrey on the Iron Throne. What she didn't anticipate was the chain reaction this would set off across the Seven Kingdoms. Lords who had sworn fealty to Robert now questioned the legitimacy of his supposed heir, especially as whispers about Joffrey's true parentage spread like wildfire. Ned Stark's attempt to reveal the truth about Joffrey's parentage, that he was not Robert's son, but the product of incest between Cersei and her brother Jaime, was met with swift and brutal retaliation. His arrest in the throne room, orchestrated by Littlefinger's betrayal, sent shockwaves throughout the realm. The North's most powerful lord, the man who had helped Robert win his crown, was now a prisoner charged with treason. The news of Ned's imprisonment travelled swiftly to Winterfell, where his eldest son Robb received ravens from across the north. The lords of the north had not forgotten their loyalty to House Stark, and they would not stand by while their liege lord rotted in a cell. But even as Robb called his banners, few could have predicted the scope of the conflict that was about to engulf the entire continent. The execution of Ned Stark became the spark that ignited the powder keg. Joffrey's decision to behead the former Hand, against the advice of his mother and the small council, transformed what might have been a negotiated settlement into an unforgivable blood feud. The North would never bend the knee to the boy who killed their beloved lord, and with Ned's death, any hope of peaceful resolution died with him. The War of the Five Kings earned its name from the 5 men who simultaneously claimed royal authority over parts or all of the 7 kingdoms. Each brought their own motivations, strengths, and fatal flaws to the conflict, creating a complex web of competing interests that would define the political landscape for years to come. Joffrey Baratheon sat the Iron Throne by right of birth, or so it appeared. The eldest son of Robert Baratheon and Cersei Lannister, Joffrey's claim seemed straightforward until questions arose about his legitimacy. His cruel nature and erratic behavior made him enemies even among his own court, but the backing of House Lannister's gold and military might kept him in power. Joffrey's reign was characterized by impulsive decisions and sadistic impulses, turning potential allies into bitter enemies. His claim rested on the assumption that he was Robert's true-born son, but the growing awareness of his bastard status undermined his authority from the very beginning. Stannis Baratheon represented the most legally sound claim to the throne. As Robert's younger brother and the rightful heir in the absence of legitimate children, Stannis possessed the strongest claim by traditional Westerosi law. However, his rigid personality and harsh interpretation of justice made him few friends. His conversion to the faith of R'Lishel, the Lord of Light, under the influence of the Red Priestess Melisandre, alienated many potential supporters who viewed the foreign religion with suspicion. Stannis was a capable military commander, but lacked the charisma and political acumen necessary to build the coalitions required for successful rule. Renly Baratheon chose to press his own claim, despite being the youngest Baratheon brother, arguing that he would make a better king than Stannis. Renly's claim was the weakest legally, but he compensated with political savvy and personal charm. His marriage alliance with House Tyrell through Margaery gave him access to the Reach's considerable resources and manpower. Renly understood that perception often mattered more than legal right in the Game of Thrones, and he cultivated an image of a king who would bring peace and prosperity. His sudden death at the hands of a shadow creature sent by Melisandre robbed the realm of perhaps its most politically astute claimant. Robb Stark never intended to claim the Iron Throne for himself, but his declaration as king in the North represented a fundamental rejection of Southern authority. Robb's motivations were deeply personal, avenging his father's death and protecting the North from Southern aggression. His claim was rooted not in conquest, but in the ancient independence of the North, harking back to the days before Aegon's conquest, when the Starks ruled as kings of winter. Robb's youth and military prowess made him a formidable opponent, but his inexperience in political matters would ultimately prove costly. Balon Greyjoy's decision to crown himself king of the Iron Islands represented an opportunistic grab for independence. The Ironborn had never fully accepted their integration into the Seven Kingdoms, and the chaos following Robert's death presented a chance to reclaim their traditional way of life. Balon's claim was based on historical precedent. The Iron Islands had been an independent kingdom before the Targaryens, and the Ironborn belief that they were a distinct people with their own customs and traditions. His invasion of the North, striking at the weakened Stark lands, demonstrated the purely pragmatic nature of his ambitions. Each of these 5 kings brought different resources to bear in their struggles for power. The Lannisters possessed the wealth of Casterly Rock and control of the capital, giving them significant advantages in terms of funding armies and controlling the narrative. The Starks commanded fierce loyalty from their bannermen and had proven themselves as capable military leaders, but lacked the numbers and resources of their southern enemies. Stannis had the support of tradition and law, plus the formidable naval power of Dragonstone, but struggled to expand his base of support. The Tyrells brought the agricultural wealth of the Reach and the largest armies in Westeros, making them kingmakers regardless of which claimant they supported.
The War of the Five Kings was defined not just by battles and sieges, but by the constantly shifting web of alliances that determined the fate of kingdoms. In this conflict, today's ally could become tomorrow's enemy, and survival often depended on reading the political winds correctly. The intricate dance of diplomacy, marriage pacts and betrayals created a landscape where victory could turn to defeat in a single decisive moment. The initial battle lines seemed clear enough. The Starks and their northern bannermen stood against the Lannisters and their Westerlands forces, while the Baratheon brothers competed for the loyalty of the Stormlords and other crown lands. But as the war progressed, these simple divisions gave way to a complex matrix of competing interests and temporary conveniences. House Tyrell's decision to back Renly Baratheon represented one of the war's most significant early alliances. The marriage between Renly and Margaery Tyrell bound together the strength of the Reach with the charisma of the youngest Baratheon brother. This alliance transformed Renly from a minor player into a serious contender, giving him access to the largest army in Westeros and the agricultural resources to sustain a long campaign. The sight of Renly's host, nearly 100,000 strong, marching toward King's Landing, struck fear into the hearts of his enemies and gave hope to those who opposed Joffrey's reign. However, the supernatural assassination of Renly shattered this alliance and forced House Tyrell to reconsider their options. Rather than backing Stannis, who had the strongest legal claim, the Tyrells made a pragmatic decision to ally with the Lannisters. The Battle of the Blackwater would prove to be the turning point of the war, as the combined forces of the Lannisters and Tyrells crushed Stannis' assault on King's Landing. This alliance was sealed by the betrothal of Margaery Tyrell to King Joffrey, transforming potential enemies into essential allies. The Northern Campaign revealed the tactical brilliance of Robb Stark, but also highlighted the importance of political marriages and alliances. Robb's early victories at Oxcross and the Whispering Wood demonstrated his military capabilities, but his decision to marry Jane Westerling out of honor and love rather than political necessity would prove catastrophic. This choice broke his betrothal to one of Walder Frey's daughters, earning the enmity of the notoriously vindictive Lord of the Crossing. The Freys had been crucial allies to the Stark cause, controlling the strategic crossing at the Twins that allowed northern armies to move south. Walder Frey's decision to allow Robb's army to cross had been predicated on the marriage alliance that would elevate his house's status. When Robb broke this pact, he not only lost a crucial ally, but gained a dangerous enemy. The Freys' desire for revenge would fester throughout the conflict, eventually manifesting in the most shocking betrayal of the entire war. Catelyn Stark's release of Jaime Lannister represented another pivotal moment in the web of alliances. Her desperate attempt to secure the release of her daughters by freeing the Kingslayer undermined Robb's position and damaged northern morale. This decision, made out of maternal love rather than strategic thinking, demonstrated how personal motivations could override political considerations with devastating consequences. The loss of such a valuable prisoner not only deprived the North of crucial leverage, but also allowed Jaime to return to King's Landing and resume his role as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. The Ironborn invasion of the North added another layer of complexity to the conflict. Balon Greyjoy's decision to attack the Starks while they were engaged in the South represented a calculated betrayal of old alliances. Theon Greyjoy's capture of Winterfell, his childhood home, epitomized the tragic nature of divided loyalties that characterized the war. Theon's desperate attempt to prove himself to his biological family led him to betray the Starks who had raised him, a decision that would haunt him for years to come.
The sack of Winterfell and the supposed deaths of Bran and Rickon Stark struck a devastating blow to northern morale. The news that the Stark stronghold had fallen and that Ned Stark's younger sons were dead spread throughout the army, weakening the resolve of many northern lords, who began to question whether the war could be won. The symbolic importance of Winterfell to the North's identity made its loss particularly demoralizing, even though the reports of the Stark boys' deaths were fabricated. Tywin Lannister's strategic brilliance became apparent as he orchestrated a series of alliances that would ultimately secure victory for his house. His negotiations with House Frey and House Bolton represented masterful political maneuvering, turning key northern allies against their liege lord. The promise of advancement and reward proved more compelling than loyalty for these ambitious lords, who saw an opportunity to elevate their positions by betraying the Starks. Roose Bolton's gradual betrayal of the Stark cause demonstrated how the war's length and cost eroded traditional loyalties. The Dreadfort Lord, known for his pragmatic approach to politics, concluded that the North could not win against the combined might of the South. His secret negotiations with Tywin Lannister positioned House Bolton to emerge as the new rulers of the North, while the Starks would be eliminated as a political force. The Red Wedding represented the culmination of these shifting alliances and betrayals. The violation of guest right, one of the most sacred laws in Westeros, shocked the realm and demonstrated how the war had corrupted traditional values. The massacre of Robb Stark, his mother Catelyn, and most of the northern leadership at what should have been a celebratory feast marked the effective end of Northern independence and the beginning of Lannister dominance. However, even as the Lannisters consolidated their victory, new threats emerged to challenge their supremacy. The death of King Joffrey at his own wedding feast, poisoned by the unlikely alliance of Olenna Tyrell and Petyr Baelish, showed that even at the moment of triumph, the Game of Thrones continued. The Tyrells' decision to eliminate Joffrey stemmed from their desire to protect Margaery from an abusive husband, while maintaining their alliance with House Lannister through her subsequent marriage to Tommen. The war's aftermath saw the emergence of new power structures that would define the political landscape for years to come. House Bolton's elevation as Wardens of the North came at the cost of their reputation and legitimacy, as they were seen as traitors and kinslayers throughout the realm. The Frey's reward for their betrayal, similarly, came with a heavy price in terms of honor and respect, making them pariahs among the noble houses of Westeros. The conflict also highlighted the rise of lesser houses and individuals who had seized opportunities during the chaos. Petyr Baelish's manipulation of events from behind the scenes elevated him from a minor Lord of the Fingers to Lord of Harrenhal and Lord Protector of the Vale. His orchestration of key events, from Ned Stark's betrayal to the poisoning of King Joffrey, demonstrated how intelligence and cunning could triumph over noble blood and military might. The War of the Five Kings fundamentally altered the balance of power in Westeros, weakening the great houses and creating opportunities for new players to emerge. The massive casualties suffered by the noble houses, particularly in the North and Riverlands, left power vacuums that would take years to fill. The destruction of traditional alliances and the violation of sacred customs like guest right created a new political environment where trust was scarce and betrayal was expected. The economic cost of the war was equally devastating, as the realm's resources were exhausted by years of continuous fighting. The Iron Throne's debt to the Iron Bank of Braavos reached unsustainable levels, creating financial pressures that would constrain future rulers' options. The destruction of farmland and the displacement of populations created humanitarian crises that would linger long after the fighting ended. The War of the Five Kings served as a harsh lesson in the realities of power and the cost of ambition. Each of the Five Kings paid a terrible price for their claims to the throne, and their deaths left the realm weaker and more divided than before. The conflict demonstrated that in the Game of Thrones, there were no true winners, only survivors who learned to adapt to an ever-changing landscape of alliances and betrayals. The legacy of this war would echo throughout the remainder of the series, as the survivors carried the scars and lessons of their experiences into future conflicts. The breakdown of traditional loyalties and the rise of pragmatic politics over honor would define the new reality of Westeros, where survival depended not on noble ideals but on the ability to navigate an increasingly treacherous political landscape. The war's end did not bring peace, but rather a pause in hostilities as new threats emerged from unexpected directions. The Sparrow Movement's challenge to the established order, the return of the Targaryens with dragons, and the looming threat from beyond the wall would all test the fractured realm's ability to unite against common enemies. The War of the Five Kings had weakened Westeros at the very moment when it would need all its strength to face the challenges ahead. Our story begins with Robert's rebellion, 15 years before the main events, when Prince Rhaegar Targaryen allegedly kidnapped Lyanna Stark. Her betrothed Robert Baratheon and her brother Ned Stark rose in rebellion against the Mad King Aerys II Targaryen. The rebellion culminated at the Battle of the Trident, where Robert killed Rhaegar with his warhammer. As King's Landing fell, Aerys ordered his pyromancer to burn the city with wildfire, but Jaime Lannister killed him first, earning the name Kingslayer. Meanwhile, pregnant Queen Rhaella fled to Dragonstone with young Prince Viserys. There she died, giving birth to Daenerys Targaryen during a massive storm that destroyed the Targaryen fleet, earning the newborn the name Daenerys Stormborn. With Robert crowned king and the Targaryen line seemingly ended, Viserys and baby Daenerys were smuggled across the narrow sea to Essos, beginning their exile. Unknown to all, Jon Snow, actually Aegon Targaryen, son of Rhaegar and Lyanna, was raised as Ned Stark's bastard, his true parentage hidden to protect him from Robert's wrath. When King Robert arrives at Winterfell to name Ned Stark as Hand of the King, the Game of Thrones truly begins. Robert's reign has grown corrupt and debt-ridden, while the Lannisters, particularly Queen Cersei and her twin brother Jaime, scheme for power. The discovery that Joffrey and his siblings are products of incest, not Robert's true heirs, sets the stage for the War of Five Kings. Ned's investigation into the royal children's parentage leads to his arrest and eventual execution, shocking viewers and establishing that no character was safe. This act catalyzes the conflict that will consume Westeros for years. Meanwhile, in Essos, Viserys Targaryen sells his sister Daenerys to Khal Drogo of the Dothraki in exchange for an army to reclaim their birthright. Initially traumatized and powerless, Daenerys gradually adapts to Dothraki culture, learning their language and earning respect. The transformation accelerates when she receives 3 dragon eggs as a wedding gift, petrified relics from old Valyria that everyone believes are merely decorative stones. As Daenerys grows stronger, Viserys becomes increasingly desperate and unstable, ultimately meeting his end when Drogo gives him a golden crown of molten gold. When Khal Drogo is mortally wounded, Daenerys makes a desperate deal with the witch Mirri Maz Duur to save him using blood magic. The ritual goes wrong, leaving Drogo in a vegetative state while killing her unborn son. In mercy, Daenerys smothers Drogo and burns his body on a funeral pyre, stepping into the flames with her dragon eggs. The season ends with one of television's most iconic moments, Daenerys emerging from the ashes unburned, with 3 newly hatched dragons, Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion. For the first time in over a century, dragons have returned to the world. With Robert dead and Ned executed, 5 different claimants vie for power: Joffrey Baratheon, backed by the Lannisters; Stannis Baratheon, Robert's brother; Renly Baratheon, Robert's youngest brother; Robb Stark, seeking northern independence; and eventually Balon Greyjoy, claiming the Iron Islands' independence. The war fragments Westeros as armies clash across the continent. Robb Stark wins several victories but makes crucial political mistakes, while Tyrion Lannister proves instrumental in defending King's Landing against Stannis' assault during the Battle of Blackwater. With her small khalasar, Daenerys leads her followers across the Red Waste, her dragons still small but growing. Her journey takes her to Qarth, the greatest city in Essos, where she encounters the mysterious House of the Undying. There the warlocks show her prophetic visions, the Iron Throne covered in snow, the Red Keep's roof destroyed, and herself walking through King's Landing as ash falls like snow, imagery that will prove prophetic in the series' final seasons. These visions establish Daenerys' destiny while hinting at the destruction to come. She rescues her dragons from the warlocks and leaves Qarth with ships and supplies, beginning her true campaign. North of the Wall, the Night's Watch expedition led by Lord Commander Jair Mormont discovers that the White Walkers, ancient enemies of mankind, are not mere legend. At the Fist of the First Men, they witness the army of the dead, composed of whites, reanimated corpses, led by the White Walkers themselves. This revelation shifts the entire narrative scope. While the living fight their petty wars for iron chairs, an existential threat to all humanity masses beyond the Wall, only the Night's Watch stands between Westeros and annihilation, but they are undermanned, under-equipped, and completely unprepared for what's coming. The War of Five Kings reaches its most shocking climax at the Red Wedding. Robb Stark, having broken his marriage pact with the Freys, attempts to make amends by attending the wedding of his uncle Edmure to Roslyn Frey. However, Walder Frey and Roose Bolton, secretly working with Tywin Lannister, orchestrate a brutal massacre. Robb, his pregnant wife Talisa, and Catelyn Stark are murdered during what should have been a celebration. The North's rebellion is effectively ended in a single night, demonstrating the ruthless pragmatism required to survive in Westeros while eliminating one of the major claimants to power. In Essos, Daenerys begins her transformation from survivor to conqueror. She acquires the Unsullied army in Astapor through a clever deception, using Drogon to kill the Good Masters after they hand over their entire army. This marks her first major victory through dragon power. She continues to Yunkai and then Meereen, gradually building a reputation as a liberator of slaves and a force for justice. However, her idealism begins to clash with the harsh realities of ruling, as former slaves struggle to adapt to freedom and former masters plot against her. Her dragons grow larger and more dangerous, but also more difficult to control. The balance between being a liberator and a conqueror becomes increasingly precarious as her power grows. At Hardhome and beyond the Wall, the White Walker threat becomes increasingly apparent. The Night King, leader of the White Walkers, demonstrates the ability to raise massive armies of the dead. Ancient magic that once held them back begins to weaken, and their march south becomes inevitable. Jon Snow's time with the Wildlings reveals that the Free Folk have been fleeing south, not out of aggression, but in terror of what lies beyond. The true enemy isn't each other, it's the army of the dead that threatens to consume everything in its path. King Joffrey's death at his own wedding feast removes one of the series' most despised characters, while creating new political complications. Tyrion is framed for the murder, leading to his trial by combat and eventual escape to Essos. The power vacuum in King's Landing allows other players to make their moves. Tywin Lannister's death at Tyrion's hands eliminates one of the most effective political minds in Westeros, leaving the Lannister dynasty vulnerable just as new threats emerge from all directions. In Meereen, Daenerys faces the harsh realities of ruling. Her dragons, now large enough to kill, become increasingly uncontrollable. When Drogon kills a child, she makes the painful decision to chain Rhaegal and Viserion in the pyramid's depths, though Drogon escapes her control entirely. This period reveals the central tension in Daenerys' character. Her desire to rule justly conflicts with the brutal pragmatism required for effective leadership. The Sons of the Harpy begin their insurgency, and Daenerys realizes that conquest and governance require different skills entirely. Her relationship with Daario Naharis and her advisors, particularly Jorah Mormont and Tyrion Lannister, when he arrives, helps develop her understanding of power, but also reveals her isolation as a leader who must make impossible choices. Beyond the Wall, the White Walker threat continues growing. The Night's Watch faces internal strife as Jon Snow's controversial decisions, including his mission to Hardhome to evacuate the wildlings, create tension within the Order. The massacre at Hardhome becomes a turning point, as Jon witnesses firsthand the Night King's power to raise the dead instantly. Thousands of wildlings die and are immediately added to the army of the dead, demonstrating the futility of conventional warfare against this enemy. Daenerys' rule in Meereen reaches a crisis point as the Sons of the Harpy escalate their attacks. The death of Sir Barristan Selmy, one of her most trusted advisors, forces her to make increasingly harsh decisions. Her marriage to Hisdar zo Loraq represents a political compromise that satisfies no one. The fighting pits of Meereen become the stage for Daenerys' most dramatic moment yet. When the Sons of the Harpy attack during the games, all seems lost until Drogon returns, fully grown and magnificent. Daenerys mounts her dragon for the first time, flying away from immediate danger, but leaving her city in chaos. This scene represents both triumph and failure. She has become a dragon rider, fulfilling Targaryen destiny, but has abandoned her people in their moment of need. The tension between personal power and responsibility reaches a critical point. In King's Landing, Cersei's empowerment of the Faith militant backfires spectacularly when they arrest her for adultery and other crimes. The rise of the High Sparrow represents a populist challenge to noble privilege, while Cersei's Walk of Shame becomes one of the series' most memorable sequences. These events weaken the Crown's authority, just as external threats multiply, creating a power vacuum that various factions attempt to fill.
Jon Snow's election as Lord Commander of the Night's Watch puts him in an impossible position. His decision to allow the wildlings south of the Wall, recognizing they must unite against the White Walkers, proves deeply unpopular among his brothers. The tension culminates in Jon's assassination by his own men, led by Alliser Thorne. The season ends with Snow's apparent death, though his connection to the larger destiny suggests this isn't the end of his story. Melisandre's resurrection of Jon Snow confirms his crucial role in the wars to come. His return from death changes him, making him more focused on the ultimate threat, while still struggling with the burden of leadership. The Battle of the Bastards represents one of television's greatest battle sequences, while resolving the Bolton threat to the north. Jon's victory, aided by the Vale forces led by Sansa Stark, restores Stark control to Winterfell and begins uniting the north against the coming storm. Jon's acclamation as king in the north represents not just political victory, but recognition that the north must be united and strong to face what's coming from beyond the Wall. Across the Narrow Sea, Daenerys' storyline reaches several climactic moments. Her burning of the coals in Vaes Dothrak demonstrates her fireproof nature, while giving her control of the largest Dothraki horde in history. Her return to Meereen coincides with the siege by the Master's fleets, leading to one of her most impressive displays of power. With all three dragons now large enough to be devastating weapons, she destroys the enemy fleet while Tyrion negotiates terms. This victory allows her to finally leave Essos behind. The season culminates with Daenerys' long-awaited departure for Westeros, her massive fleet carrying dragons, Dothraki, Unsullied, and Iron Island's allies. After 6 seasons of building power and learning to rule, she's finally ready to reclaim her birthright. Bran Stark's training with the Three-Eyed Raven reveals crucial information about the White Walkers' origins. They were created by the Children of the Forest as weapons against the First Men. This revelation recontextualizes the entire conflict, suggesting that humanity's current crisis stems from ancient conflicts and magical warfare. The attack on the cave and the Three-Eyed Raven's death forces Bran to assume his role before completing his training, setting up his importance in the final conflict, while burdening him with incomplete knowledge. Daenerys' arrival in Westeros begins with strategic brilliance but quickly faces unexpected challenges. Her attack on the Lannister supply train featuring a fully grown Drogon and Dothraki warriors demonstrates her overwhelming military superiority while showcasing the terror dragons bring to conventional warfare. However, the political landscape proves more complex than she anticipated. Her meeting with Jon Snow at Dragonstone begins one of the series' most important relationships, both personal and political. Jon's focus on the White Walker threat initially seems like a distraction to Daenerys, but gradually becomes central to her own destiny. The expedition beyond the Wall to capture a White and prove the White Walker threat represents both heroic desperation and tactical disaster. While the mission succeeds in its immediate goal, it costs Daenerys one of her dragons when the Night King kills Viserion with an ice spear. The Night King's resurrection of Viserion as an undead ice dragon fundamentally changes the balance of power. The Wall, which has protected Westeros for 8,000 years, becomes vulnerable to dragonfire. The barrier between the living and dead begins to crumble. The season finale brings together nearly all major surviving characters at the Dragon Pit in King's Landing. The demonstration of the captured White convinces most attendees of the threat's reality, leading to an uneasy alliance between former enemies. Simultaneously, Bran and Sam's research reveals Jon Snow's true parentage. He is Aegon Targaryen, legitimate son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, making him the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, a revelation that will complicate his developing relationship with Daenerys. The season ends with the Wall's destruction as Viserion, now an ice dragon, brings down the ancient barrier. The army of the dead marches south, and the Great War between the living and dead officially begins. The Battle of Winterfell represents the climax of the White Walker threat that has built throughout the entire series. Nearly every major character fights for survival as the army of the dead assaults the last major stronghold between them and the rest of Westeros. The battle showcases the full horror of the undead army while testing every alliance forged throughout the series. Dragons fight in the sky while heroes fall defending the living. The darkness seems overwhelming until Arya Stark delivers the killing blow to the Night King, destroying him and his entire army in a single moment. This victory eliminates the supernatural threat but leaves the political conflicts unresolved, setting up the final confrontation for the Iron Throne. With the White Walker threat ended, Daenerys' attention turns fully to her claim on the Iron Throne. However, Jon's true parentage creates a succession crisis, while his popularity in Westeros threatens her own legitimacy. The death of Missandei and Daenerys' increasing isolation drive her toward the madness that plagued her father. Despite King's Landing's surrender, she chooses to burn the city with dragonfire, killing hundreds of thousands of innocents. This act transforms her from liberator to tyrant, forcing Jon Snow, revealed as Aegon Targaryen, to make the ultimate sacrifice. He kills the woman he loves to save the realm from her growing tyranny, ending the Targaryen restoration before it truly begins. Bran Stark's selection as king represents a fundamental shift in Westeros's political structure. Rather than hereditary monarchy, the realm chooses a ruler based on wisdom and the ability to see beyond normal human limitations. The independent North under Queen Sansa Stark, Arya's journey west of Westeros, and Jon's return beyond the Wall suggest that the old feudal system is breaking down, replaced by new forms of governance and identity. The Game of Thrones timeline reveals a story about power, responsibility, and the costs of both. Daenerys Targaryen's rise from exiled princess to Dragon Queen to Mad Queen illustrates how the pursuit of power can corrupt even the most well-intentioned rulers. Meanwhile, the White Walker threat served as a reminder that humanity's greatest enemy is often not each other, but the existential threats that require unity to overcome. The irony is that by the time the living united against the dead, the political conflicts had already set in motion the events that would lead to even greater destruction. The series ultimately suggests that true power lies not in conquest or dragons or prophecies, but in the choices individuals make when faced with impossible decisions. Whether protecting the innocent, sacrificing personal desires for the greater good, or choosing mercy over vengeance, the characters who find meaning in their stories are those who remain true to their principles even when it costs them everything. From the ashes of the old world rises something new, imperfect perhaps, but offering hope that the wheel of oppression Daenerys spoke of breaking has indeed been broken, replaced by something that might, eventually, prove better for the common people of Westeros. In the end, the Game of Thrones was won not by the strongest dragon or the sharpest sword, but by the wisdom to recognize when the game itself needed to change.
Season 8 opens with an unprecedented alliance at Winterfell. Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen have united their forces against the Night King's army of the dead. The castle becomes a melting pot of former enemies. Northmen stand beside unsullied soldiers. Dothraki warriors sharpen their weapons alongside Knights of the Vale. And even former foes like Jaime Lannister arrive seeking redemption. The preparations are intense and emotional. Characters who began their journeys as children now face what may be their final hours. Arya Stark, once a frightened girl fleeing King's Landing, has become a master assassin. She reconnects with Gendry, forging Valyrian steel weapons
and finding love on the eve of potential doom. Meanwhile, her sister Sansa has evolved into a political strategist, managing the complex logistics of housing and feeding this massive army. Bran Stark, now the three-eyed raven, serves as both weapon and bait. His connection to the Night King makes him the ultimate target, but also provides crucial intelligence about their enemies' movements and motivations. The Battle of Winterfell unfolds as the longest continuous battle sequence in television history. As darkness falls, the army of the dead crashes against Winterfell's defenses like a supernatural tsunami. The Dothraki charge opens the battle in spectacular and tragic fashion. Their flaming Aragons, blessed by Melisandre's magic, provide a brief moment of hope before being extinguished in the darkness beyond. The silence that follows their charge into the void is deafening, instantly communicating the hopelessness of the situation. What follows is chaos incarnate. The dead pour over the walls like water, forcing the living into increasingly desperate positions. Lyanna Mormont, the fierce young lady of Bear Island, makes her final stand against a white giant, embodying the courage of House Mormont even as she falls. Her sacrifice becomes one of many heroic moments that define the battle. Dragons dance in the sky above, breathing fire that temporarily illuminates the battlefield. Jon Snow and Daenerys ride Rockall and Drogon respectively, but even dragonfire proves insufficient against the endless tide of whites. The Night King's ice dragon, the reanimated Viserion, turns the sky into another battleground. In the crypts below, the supposed safety zone becomes a horror as the dead Starks rise from their tombs. This twist reinforces that nowhere is truly safe from the Night King's power, and that even the honored dead can become weapons against the living. As defeat seems inevitable, with the living pushed to their final positions, the Night King approaches the Godswood to claim his ultimate prize, Bran Stark. The confrontation between these ancient enemies plays out in haunting silence, two beings who exist beyond normal human experience facing each other in a moment that will determine the fate of all life. Theon Greyjoy makes his redemption complete with a final, futile charge at the Night King. His death serves as the last desperate act before all seems lost. The Night King approaches Bran, raising his sword for the killing blow that would cement his victory. Then comes the moment that changes everything. Arya Stark, trained by the Faceless Men, and carrying a Valyrian steel dagger that has passed through many hands throughout the series, launches herself at the Night King. Her leap through the air, the Night King's inhuman reflexes catching her by the throat, and her crucial weapon switch that drives the blade into his heart. These seconds determine the outcome of the Great War. The Night King's destruction triggers a cascade effect. Every White Walker, every creature of ice and death crumbles to dust. The ancient threat that has loomed over humanity for millennia ends with a teenage girl's perfectly executed strike. Victory against the dead comes at an enormous cost. Half the Allied forces lie fallen, including beloved characters and countless unnamed soldiers. The celebration is subdued, tinged with grief and the knowledge that another war awaits. The Iron Throne remains contested, and Cersei Lannister still holds King's Landing, with the Golden Company and Euron Greyjoy's Iron Fleet. The political dynamics shift dramatically in the aftermath. Jon Snow's true parentage, revealed as Aegon Targaryen with a stronger claim to the throne, creates tension with Daenerys. Despite Jon's protestations that he doesn't want to rule, the mere existence of his claim threatens Daenerys' life's work. Sansa Stark's growing independence also creates friction. Having seen Daenerys' capacity for destruction and recognizing the threat she poses to northern autonomy, Sansa begins maneuvering for northern independence. Her political acumen, learned through trauma and observation, puts her at odds with the Dragon Queen. Daenerys Targaryen's transformation from liberator to tyrant unfolds through a series of devastating losses. First, she loses her second dragon Rhaegal to Euron Greyjoy's scorpion bolts during a surprise attack. The death of her child represents both a tactical disaster and a profound personal loss. Her isolation deepens when Missandei, her closest friend and advisor, is captured and executed by Cersei Lannister. The brutal beheading, witnessed by Daenerys and Grey Worm, serves as Cersei's final act of defiance and cruelty. For Daenerys, it represents the loss of the last person who truly knew her as a person, rather than just a queen. Meanwhile, Jon Snow's heritage becomes public knowledge despite his wishes. Varys, the Master of Whisperers, begins plotting to place Jon on the throne, believing him to be a more suitable ruler. His schemes lead to his execution by Dragonfire, another relationship severed, and another step toward Daenerys' isolation. The signs of her growing instability multiply. Her advisors, Tyrion, Jorah, before his death at Winterfell, and Varys, had served as moral anchors, but their influence wanes as paranoia takes hold. The woman who once chained her dragons for killing a single child now contemplates burning an entire city. The final assault on King's Landing begins as a conventional siege.
Daenerys, riding Drogon, systematically destroys the Iron Fleet and the city's defensive scorpions. The Golden Company falls quickly, and Cersei's forces begin surrendering as the city's bells ring out in submission. For a moment, it seems the city might be taken without massive civilian casualties. The bells ring, the soldiers lay down their arms, and surrender appears complete. This is the crucial moment when Daenerys faces her choice: accept victory with mercy or embrace fire and blood. She chooses fire. What follows is one of television's most controversial sequences. Daenerys, overwhelmed by grief, isolation, and perhaps genetic predisposition to madness, systematically burns King's Landing. Block by block, street by street, she reduces the city to ash and bone. Civilians flee in terror as dragonfire consumes everything in its path. The sequence is filmed to emphasize the horror from the ground level. We follow Arya Stark through the burning streets as she witnesses the destruction firsthand. The Mother of Dragons has become the very thing she once fought against, a tyrant who rules through fear and death. Jon Snow, fighting in the streets below, watches in horror as his allies and enemies alike are consumed by flames. Grey Worm and the Unsullied begin executing prisoners, while Dothraki warriors pillage and murder. The liberation has become a massacre. Cersei Lannister meets her end, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the collapse of the Red Keep. She and Jaime, reunited in their final moments, die together as tons of stone crush them. Their end is almost anticlimactic compared to the destruction raging outside. In the aftermath, King's Landing lies in ruins. Daenerys stands before the remaining forces, giving a speech that reveals her true intentions. She speaks of liberating the world, of bringing her definition of freedom to every corner of the known world. The liberator has become a conqueror, and the conqueror has become a destroyer. Tyrion's horror at the destruction leads to his imprisonment for treason. Jon Snow faces an impossible choice. The woman he loves has become a monster, but she's also the queen he swore to serve. The weight of duty and love pull him in opposite directions. The confrontation in the throne room becomes the series' emotional climax. Daenerys finally reaches the Iron Throne she has sought her entire adult life, but the victory is hollow. The throne room is damaged, ash falls like snow, and the crown she has won rules over a kingdom of corpses. Jon's decision to kill Daenerys is both inevitable and tragic. Their final kiss becomes the delivery method for a dagger to the heart. It's a moment that parallels the series' themes of love and duty, honor and pragmatism. Jon chooses the realm over his heart, duty over love. Drogon's reaction to his mother's death provides a moment of unexpected intelligence and restraint. Rather than killing Jon, the dragon destroys the Iron Throne itself, the object that corrupted so many and led to his mother's downfall. He then carries Daenerys' body away, disappearing into legend. With both claimants to the Iron Throne dead or exiled, the great lords and ladies of Westeros face an unprecedented situation. For the first time in generations, they must choose their ruler rather than simply accepting hereditary succession. The Great Council convenes with representatives from across the Seven Kingdoms. Sansa Stark represents the North, Yara Greyjoy speaks for the Iron Islands, and various lords gather to determine the future of their realm. The absence of traditional power structures forces them to consider new forms of governance. Tyrion Lannister, despite being a prisoner, delivers the speech that shapes the kingdom's future. He proposes Bran Stark, Bran the Broken, as king, arguing that the best ruler is one who doesn't want power and whose supernatural knowledge can guide the realm wisely. The choice is controversial, but practical. Bran's lack of personal desires and his omniscient perspective through his three-eyed raven abilities make him uniquely qualified to rule impartially. He cannot father children, meaning the throne won't become hereditary again immediately.
The coronation of King Bran I establishes several important precedents. The Iron Throne is gone, literally and symbolically, replaced by a simpler seat that represents service rather than domination. The new king rules with the consent of the great lords rather than through conquest or birthright. Sansa Stark achieves her goal of northern independence, becoming queen in the north. This recognition of regional autonomy represents a fundamental shift in how the Seven Kingdoms, now 6 kingdoms, function. The precedent suggests that unity can coexist with local self-determination. Arya Stark chooses adventure over politics, sailing west to explore what lies beyond the known world. Her journey represents the spirit of discovery and the unknown future that awaits beyond the series' conclusion. Jon Snow, revealed as Aegon Targaryen but exiled for regicide, returns to the Night's Watch. However, the Watch's purpose has changed. With the White Walkers destroyed and the Wall partially fallen, Jon's exile becomes a journey beyond the Wall with the Free Folk. He finds peace in the wilderness, finally free from the political machinations that have defined his life. The new small council reflects the changed nature of Westerosi politics. Tyrion serves as Hand of the King, bringing his intelligence and hard-won wisdom to governance. Sir Brienne of Tarth becomes Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, fulfilling her oath to serve and protect. Samwell Tarly becomes Grand Maester, representing the importance of knowledge and learning in the new order. These appointments signal a move away from the purely aristocratic system toward meritocracy. The council includes people who earn their positions through service and ability, rather than just birthright. The kingdom they govern is fundamentally different from the one Robert Baratheon ruled at the series' beginning. The population has been devastated by wars, the economy needs rebuilding, and the very concept of centralized monarchy has been questioned and reformed. The ending addresses the series' central themes of power, identity, and the cost of ambition. The Iron Throne's destruction symbolizes the end of absolute monarchy and the beginning of a more collaborative form of governance. The choice of Bran as king represents wisdom over strength, service over dominance. The fate of the Stark children illustrates different responses to trauma and power. Sansa channels her experiences into political leadership, Arya seeks freedom and adventure, Bran accepts the burden of rule, and Jon finds peace in exile. Each path reflects their individual growth and the choices available in the new world. The series concludes with a sense of cautious optimism. The great threats have been defeated, the cycle of violence has been broken, and new forms of governance offer hope for a better future. However, the cost has been enormous, and the scars of war and conflict will take generations to heal.